Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome to Money Sense with your host this morning, Christophe Barnett, and myself, Simon Caudry. Good morning, Christophe. This morning we're going to continue our conversation series with and about the Cayman financial industry. And with that in mind, I'm delighted to be rejoined by Jude Scott, who will be familiar to all of our listeners as the CEO of Cayman Finance. Good morning, Jude.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us. And also this morning, we're joined by Alastair Robertson. Alastair is the president of the Cayman Islands Law Society and the current managing partner of Maples the global managing partner, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, Simon.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Alastair.
Pleasure.
So this morning's show is going to focus on the legal industry, what the legal industry does here in Cayman, what is happening in the legal industry, and what's going to happen or what's likely to happen in terms of legislative developments that affect the Cayman community. Because, of course, what happens in government and what the Law Association, the Legal Society put together clearly impacts almost every other community or association here in the Cayman Islands. So thank you both for joining us. So let's just crack right onto it if we can. Alastair, you've been in Cayman as a lawyer for how many years? How many years have you been living and working here?
Oh, God, I've got to add that up now. I've been in Cayman full-time since 2001. But I actually started at Maples and Call as a summer student back in 1992. So if you include that, a very long time.
Well, goodness me. And tell us then, in the Cayman Islands, what sort of industries does the law actually cover? I mean, is it literally covering everything? I mean, where are the focus areas here in the Cayman community?
Yeah, I think in Cayman we're slightly different to a sort of larger society in some ways because of the focus of financial services. But you need to make sure we don't forget that the legal profession covers everything. So you've got your big tick international transactions, but also you've got your simple things like property conveyancing. Unfortunately, in life, you've got litigation and you've got things like divorce. So we cover the very wide spectrum, and alongside me, there's around 600 lawyers on the roll here. So those lawyers will cover that great sphere of different types of work. Although naturally, there's a much bigger focus on financial services. That's why, for such a small place like Cayman, we've got over 600 lawyers on the roll.
And when you say financial services, that's a very broad area. So if we can narrow that down, where in particular do the lawyers on this island actually focus, and what industries do they specifically focus on? So
the largest, it's no secret that Cayman are considered to be the leading offshore funds jurisdiction. So the funds industry does contribute the biggest element of lawyers. Law is an integral part to that. So the funds industry in Cayman deals with a lot of different sectors, in particular accountants, fiduciary service providers, but the lawyers are a very important component of that because they're the ones who form structure and advise on the specific entities. So they provide a very big input and a very big component to that financial services industry.
Right, and I heard you say that there are about 600 lawyers working here on island. How many people who are considered Caymanian actually work in this industry, and how do people get into this industry? So, I mean, we talk about the industry sometimes, and we kind of sometimes lose track of what's actually going on and how does one get into this industry. So, just talk us about that, if you would.
Yeah, no, I think first thing that might interest our listeners is actually there's over 200 Caymanians on the roll here. So, if you consider when we formed a society back in 1967, there was 7 members. That's an amazing success story that we've gone from 7 to over 230. I think over time, the percentage of Caymanians with the industry has grown quite remarkably, in large part to the success of the industry. I mean, Cayman has really led the way in the offshore world, so that we've provided those opportunities. And I think when you ally that together with the fact that we do actually have a law school here, so it's relatively easy, to be honest, to be admitted, well, not to be admitted, to go to law school here, in that you've got a law school on your doors. You don't have to go overseas to learn how to do law. So the establishment of what's now called the Truman Bodden Law School, I think, is very integral to that point. And the key is that the Truman Bodden Law School is actually their degrees from the University of Liverpool, which is an English recognised law degree, and that's absolutely key because we want to be at the top of our game, and we need to be at a global level able to provide lawyers of the best quality. And having that affiliation with the University of Liverpool, which is a leading university in the UK, is very, very important.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, one thing you said, which was that Cayman, it's no secret that Cayman has been taking the lead in the financial services sector, offshore particularly. Why is that? We often hear this said. We often hear Cayman is a leading financial jurisdiction. And, this is something for Jude, you can weigh in as well, I suppose. But why is it that Cayman, in what has been a relatively short period of time, if you think in the 70s, there wasn't an awful lot of financial industry going on in Cayman. So why is Cayman today in this situation?
Well, really down to the foresight of our forefathers, to be honest. I mean, there's some names people will recognise, but the likes of Bill Walker, who founded Walker's, the likes of Tim Ridley and Tony Travers, who really developed sort of Maples and Calder, but together with people in the government. Because you've got to remember, this is the success of the industry is not solely down to the lawyers within the private sector. It's actually down to the collaboration with government. And back in the 1970s, they worked very well together to establish the framework. And we obviously started in a lot of ways with the companies law, and we then expanded into the exempted limited partnership law. And sort of as time progressed, we were able to move pretty quickly together as a jurisdiction. Sort of a saying that we all work for Cayman Inc. basically. And by that collaboration together, we're able to get products and new products in front of global clients very quickly. And also, I think our ability to attract the best of the best has really sort of pushed the jurisdiction, because unfortunately in the global world, it's incredibly competitive. And unless you've got the top lawyers who were able to work for the big guys in London and New York in particular, and able to understand what they're trying to do, then it's very difficult. And we hear time and time again from managing partners of global law firms that what they love about Cayman is that the lawyers truly understand what they're trying to do and are very responsive.
And you say that one of the key things is the talent you can attract. We have, when you look around at the legal community, there's 200 Caymanians. That means there's 400 non-Caymanians who are seemingly from almost all jurisdictions around the world, which presumably is helpful in terms of building that network of contacts around the world.
Very much so. For the non-Caymanian lawyers, they tend to come from onshore law firms and come with a very good checklist. What we've tried, and certainly that the larger law firms have tried to do with the Caymanian lawyers, is to send them away on scholarships. So there's a very large number. I wish actually I had the number to hand, but I don't. But there's an extremely large number of scholarships that have been handed out over the years, really with the aim of trying to get Caymanians to go overseas, both on the academic side and also to go and work, to really experience what it's like in a big city. And I think that's been extremely beneficial to allow those individuals to understand really what it's all about.
And you say scholarships, and I think that is such an important element when you look at, frankly, the cost of taking degrees and taking professional courses. A legal degree doesn't just take a couple of years, it takes a lot longer than that. And so for someone who comes from perhaps a relatively poor family who has this aspiration to be in this industry, that's a lot of cost that they would have to incur. And so the Legal Association does actually help people with that. It's
not so much the Legal Association, but our member firms. And the member firms have got an amazing track record in providing those scholarships. Again, when you choose someone to come and work for you, it's a big investment. But you've got, people understand you've got to make that investment, which is why there are very generous scholarships that they provide. Interestingly, though, most firms not only provide legal scholarships, but they also provide non-legal scholarships, because I think there's also an understanding within the legal profession that our community is just as important. So, one of the ones I've always loved is Gordon Solomon's The Artist, was sponsored by my firm to go away and do an arts degree. Nothing to do with law, but it's a good thing for the community.
Well, diversity.
Exactly.
Yeah. And how does someone who's listening to this show who says, one day I'd like to be a lawyer, what sort of qualifications at school or experiences should they be thinking about trying to have in order to be in this industry? Are there qualifications, in fact?
Yes, they are. I mean, fundamentally, you need to have very good academic results up to high school. So, looking at things like A-levels, you do need very good results. I mean, it's becoming incredibly competitive in the UK to get into law school. So, for example, if you're trying to get into what's called a Russell Group university in the UK, you're going to have 3As straight off the bat. I think academic rigor is very important because it is an intellectually challenging profession. So having very good academics is important. In terms of what subjects you do, to be honest, there is a variety. It tends to be more things like English and history, but maybe somewhat surprising to people, just as important are things like mathematics and physics, because actually there's a lot of logic involved in law. So if you've got a logical mind, that's something you need to have. And again, we're not looking for a one-size-fits-all. So we're really looking at the individual, in terms of good academics, and also, frankly, that little bit extra of what they've done outside of the classroom. Are they a leader? Have they played in team sports? Have they contributed to charities? And once they've actually finished high school, this is where you've really got kind of two options. Option A is to apply to the Truman Bodden Law School here. And then you would spend 3 years doing an undergraduate degree. And when you finish the undergraduate degree, you would then to go on to do the postgraduate course, which is a 1-year course. If you want to go overseas, which quite a few of our junior lawyers do, again, it's a 3-year degree, but obviously at a UK university. The one thing that doesn't work, and probably is worth mentioning, is going to a US university, because the US legal system is very different to ours. So it really has to be an English law degree or Truman Bodden that's really going to set you up. Once you've finished all your academics, again, there's two options really open to you, and one of them's probably forgotten by a few people, is that you can very happily go and work in an international law firm overseas and be admitted as an English, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand lawyer, and then come back to the Cayman Islands after you spent that time abroad. But the more common route, obviously, is for you to come back and be articled to a Cayman Islands law firm. Now, it's an interesting term, articled. It's a very old term, but essentially it means that for a period of 18 months, you spend under the supervision of a very highly qualified attorney who essentially takes you through and makes sure that you've got the right stuff, if I may use that term, to be an attorney. And at the end of that 18 months, he then certifies that, yes, you're good enough. And off you go for the date that everybody, I think, really, really looks forward to, which is actually the admission in the Grand Court of the Cayman Islands, which is very much a celebration of what you've achieved so far. Because at that point in time, that's probably be about 6 years of academics post high school. But also, I think it's an element of that's the start of your legal career.
Well, that's a lot of training just to get to that stage, to the start of your career, isn't it? Very
much so. And I think, again, emphasise, if you want to get into law, it's a vocation. You really need to want to do this. It's not a something that you should get in because you've watched various TV programs or you think it sounds cool. It's a lot of hard work. It's interesting, if you ask a lot of senior lawyers whether they're encouraging their children to go into law, you might be surprised to find out that they probably will say no. There's a lot of sacrifices along the route. It's very competitive, it's very challenging, and everybody's heard the stories, but it is unfortunately part of reality. It's very long hours. For my sins, used to be in the army before I became a lawyer, and I thought being in the army was great in that I spent long hours without any sleep, and then rediscovered in law that I had to do exactly the same thing, which was a little bit of a surprise.
Well, on that less than optimistic note, we're going to take a brief break and then rejoin us. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the specifics of what's going on in the legal industry here in Cayman and what's going on in the regulatory environment here in Cayman. So rejoin us after the break.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands and sponsored by One Trade X.
And now, more Money Sense.
Good morning again and welcome. We're joined this morning by Alistair Robertson, who is the president of the Cayman Islands Law Society, and by Jude Scott, as we continue our conversation series with the Cayman financial community. In the first half of the show, we were discussing what it takes for someone to be a lawyer, what they need to do, what their aspirations need to be, and what their expectations need to be. And I said in the second part of this show, we're going to talk about the current climate in Cayman and what laws are changing, what needs to change. But I want to sort of perhaps throw out a somewhat unusual question and just ask this one of you, Alistair. When someone is looking around, and there are many people every day who say, oh, I have a need for a lawyer, whether it be because I'm going through a divorce, whether it needs because I'm buying a house, how on earth should someone go about choosing a lawyer? How does someone work out who to select when because there are 600 different people? What sort of characteristics should they be looking for? What makes the right person? How do they know who the right person is?
That's a very good question, Simon. I think first off, to be honest, we're in the world of the internet these days. So, pick up the wonderful Google search tool and have a look is always a good start. All law firms have pretty good websites, so they can give you a feeling of what it's like. But, just as much, feel free to pick up the phone to me or to Hugh Moses, who's Secretary of the Law Society, where all the details are on our website, and we'll be very happy to steer people in the right direction to who might be. And obviously we wouldn't just give one name; we would give several names that people could go to look for. And I think that's probably more relevant on the sort of more domestic or local type law. In international matters, there's numerous global directories which tell people who's good and who ranks as top tier and second tier and third tier. So from an international perspective, people kind of know who the right people are.
Sure. Now let's focus a little bit on what's going on in the Cayman financial community with respect to the legal industry. There's been a few laws that have recently been talked about being amended, and I think one thing that causes a lot of confusion to the general public is this fact of, why do people own companies? Mm-hmm. What does a company actually do? There's always this perception outside of the offshore community that people use companies to avoid tax, to hide things, and all that sort of carry on. And now in Cayman, we're talking about adding to the number of companies that are allowed. We have what are called limited liability companies. But could you give us a little bit of context as to what a company actually does, why it's used by people, and what the rationale is for going down this path of limited liability companies?
Sure. So really the sort of two elements to I think your question, Simon. I mean, to get back to absolute basics, the simple purpose of the company is to allow you to run a business without personal liability. It all goes all the way back to England in the 1870s, where very famously is a chap called Mr. Solomon who wanted to run a shoe business. And the problem he faced is that, if the business didn't do that well, then he would be personally bankrupt. And so essentially they established companies to allow you to run the business. So if the business failed, the individual didn't fail. That's the basic reason for a company. Obviously, that was back in 1870. We're now at 2016. It's grown a lot more sophisticated. There's multinationals. Everybody knows numerous names of very, very large companies. But that's the fundamental basis. It's really just to allow you to run a business in a very efficient way and to really run it as an organization rather than as a single proprietor. So companies, obviously, everything from sort of Google, I suppose, at the top of the tree, all the way down to you want to run a baker's shop in the Cayman Islands, you'd probably want to run that through a company. The reason for adding these so-called LLCs is down to a very unique and sort of, in some ways, very sector-focused idea, which is, in the funds world, people use either companies, something called exempt limited partnerships, but actually there's a third type of vehicle in Delaware and certain other jurisdictions called this limited liability company. And the real advantage for an LLC, and it's kind of difficult to make this done in simple terms, but is down to the way that you account for the profits of that company. And so international investors who use Delaware LLCs want the ability to do that in a context outside of Delaware, because quite often a lot of global investors, when investing, don't want to do in the United States, primarily because of litigation risk. Mm-hmm. So we're really producing a product to meet a need of international investors in the funds industry, and it's really driven by their needs. And it's a great example, I think, of how we over time have reacted to the needs of the international industry and have been creative in providing solutions to that demand.
So when you talk about that, clearly that implies that there's a lot of activity going on in the fund space and the corporate in that particular area. Where else is Cayman seeing a lot of activity nowadays? When you look at, when we said the financial services at the beginning of the show, it's such a broad area. It covers the trust industry, it covers the insurance industry. Where else are where are the growth areas, and where are the areas that are going to be seeing legislative changes and rule changes or legal changes, perhaps is a better word?
I mean, in terms of growth, it's probably worth sort of mentioning, the sort of litigation side. The Grand Court here established what's called the Financial Services Division. It essentially created a number of different divisions, but the Financial Services Division has gone down very well. So a lot of international litigation is now actually done in the Cayman Islands. So there's a huge number of litigation lawyers here, and because these funds and structured products are international vehicles, and unfortunately it doesn't always go right all the time, there will be an increasing focus on litigation. Another sort of area which is quite big here is structured finance or financing generally. There's a lot of lawyers who are involved in cross-border financing. Again, people, when they lend money, they want to make sure that they're lending it and it's safe. And one of the great things that Cayman has, although it does need to change because it's been there for quite a while, is our company's law is very creditor-friendly. And again, that was something that was created sort of 15, 20 years ago, so it doesn't need too many tweaks, but is proved to be incredibly popular amongst international banks and international financial institutions. The other sort of area that's probably worthwhile mentioning sort of briefly is just domestically as well. I think as Cayman grows, it gets larger. The need for lawyers to deal with things like immigration, to deal with local business deals certainly grown. And I think we've seen that by the growth in smaller law firms in the Cayman Islands over the last 5 to 10 years.
Now, when I look at in some of these conversations we've been having with other sectors and other industries, and just in general conversations outside of the radio show, talk to a lot of business people and they say, I wish things could change in this area, or I wish the law would change in that area. And so there's this perception perhaps that in some areas it takes a little bit too long for laws to change and for developments to go in the way that the business or the industry wants it. Now, is that because industry is a little bit self-serving and wanting things for itself, or is that because of other reasons? What is the reason for that?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, I think there's an element of lack of resourcing at the government level. I mean, you're right, there is a lot of legislation that seems to take an enormous amount of time. Now, the reality is legislation you can't just do overnight. It does take a little bit of time, but we have found over the years that things got slower and slower. Now, we've tried to solve that, I think, through a number of different avenues. One is on the financial services side is creation of something called the Financial Services Legislative Committee, which has been a way of fast tracking key legislation that will bring additional revenue to the Cayman Islands, and that's the key point. It's really focused on products and changes which will bring new revenue to Cayman. The second element is actually as a law society, we spend an inordinate amount of our time commenting on legislation prepared by various government agencies. And I think we've tried to do that in a very constructive way. So I think the vast number of hours given freely by lawyers has assisted in that. But at the end of the day, we can only provide so much. So the more there is, the more difficult it is to provide comments in a timely manner. The last thing is to be honest, that the real bottleneck has been a government in terms of resourcing. The legislative drafting side, there needs to be more funding, should I say, and more people allocated to that division so that we can get through the so-called backlog. I mean, I've heard various numbers of pieces of legislation held up, and I think just by looking down the list, there's a fair amount. So I'm hoping we can get over it. It is concerning. There's no two ways about it. But we are trying to work collectively with government to try and resolve those issues as quickly and as efficiently as we can. So
what I'm hearing from you is some of the new legislation that is being drafted and being proposed is there specifically to allow Cayman to generate new revenue sources. So it's not necessarily about tweaking, making slight improvements. It's about new revenue sources for the island. Very much so. And again, you've got to look at legislation in two different ways, which is there's legislation which really affects the international world. It doesn't really affect people domestically. And, in that side, that should, in my view, should go through relatively quickly because it has minimal impact upon Cayman other than in a beneficial way. When it comes to stuff which will affect
people locally. So to give you an example, data protection, and there's a suggestion now by the Law Reform Commission to bring in consumer protection legislation. That requires a lot more consideration. Because while we all want to do what's done in the first world, in Europe and the US, and we want to replicate best practice, we need to remember that we are a jurisdiction of only 60,000 people, and everything needs to be proportionate. So we don't want to burden individuals and business with too much regulation, but at the same time making sure that we are internationally compliant and we do actually have laws which kind of make sense. So it can be quite a difficult job crafting something which is designed for the EU or the United States to fit Cayman's unique situation.
Let me perhaps ask Jude a question in this particular area. As thinking holistically about the Cayman financial industry, where do you see, excuse me, I'm losing my voice a bit, but where do you see the biggest where do you see the biggest opportunity in terms of new legislation that could be drafted that will benefit Cayman? Because we're talking with Alistair and you're saying, there are bottlenecks here and there. Which one of those would you like to see most cleared in order to benefit Cayman community?
The short answer is all of them. But from a big picture perspective, we're actually going through a great exercise now with Cayman Finance and with the Ministry of Financial Services, prioritizing what's in the backlog. Our objective really is, as we go through those, we deal with those. For example, there are various areas in, say, the trust and private wealth industry that we need to make sure we have foundations laws in place. We need to tweak the current trust laws. These are all very, very important things that we're focused on. It's really just a matter of prioritization right now. I think as we look at the medium term, the short answer is we actually need to get all of this legislation through, passed, and so that we're really looking at innovative legislation going forward.
I think that sort of hits on the nail of problems in all industries, in all countries, whereby every industry has its objective they want to achieve, and this is important to me, that's important to you. Well, there needs to be a prioritization process, doesn't there? Now, so how does someone, someone who's listening out there who may own a company, who says, I'd really think this piece of legislation is vitally important. How do they become an advocate for that piece of legislation to make sure that whoever it is who does the drafting and the arguing in front of government to get that on the table, that becomes top of the pile? Who do they go to advocate their point?
It's a great question, and that's really one of the fundamental things we've built into Cayman Finance. Because Cayman Finance represents the entire financial services industry, we work very closely with all of the associations, all of our member firms across the entire industry, to make sure that we have committees or subcommittees or working groups in place to create an environment where that type of information is actually fed in. We're able to discuss it and then determine as a group what are the priorities and the order in which we can best execute those. As Al has shared, really our objective from the financial services perspective is to ensure that when we build a successful financial services industry, it provides great benefit to the country and great benefit to the people. And so that's always the context in which we're looking at priorities, and we're looking at, protecting, promoting, developing, and growing the industry.
Well, that makes sense, and thank you for that, Jude. So I guess perhaps before we end, I think we've got about a minute left before the show ends. Perhaps you could just try and answer this one for me, Alistair, which perhaps is a question which may take an hour to answer. But how does legislation actually get made? In the sense of where does it start and what's the process? I know this. I'm giving you a hot potato in a short period of time, but just in a nutshell.
So really in a nutshell, it can come from a variety of different sources. So you need, as you said previously, an advocate, someone or a group of people who will put together an idea. You will then approach the relevant ministry. So in our case, the Ministry for Financial Services. You would tell them what you'd like to do. They would then prepare a paper for Cabinet. And they would go to Cabinet, get approval for what's called drafting instructions. You then go away, you draft it, you make sure it's agreed amongst the people who sort of have a specialty interest in that area, and then it goes from there back to Cabinet, gets approved, then gets published as a green bill, and then after that, a minimum 21 days of consultation would then go down to the Legislative Assembly, and then hopefully would be passed. Generally, the timeline in terms of doing that can last anywhere from, say, 6 months to 4 or 5 years, depending how controversial legislation is.
So realistically, you need to get a committee or a group of people to be supportive of that. An individual on their own they need to have the support of the wider community for that legislation to make it through those stages.
Absolutely.
Okay, fair enough. Well, thank you for that, and I appreciate your being so concise on what is, I'm sure, a very broad topic of how to make legislation. I'm afraid we do have to end it there. Our time is up, and I'd like to thank both yourself, Jude, and you, Alistair, for joining us this morning. Our show will be back on air in 2 weeks' time. Until then, thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to you joining us in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.